we're very lucky to be joined today by Johanna Gehmacher. Professor Gehmacher is currently a Fernand Braudel Fellow in the Department of History and Civilization at the EUI. She is visiting us from the University of Vienna, where she is a professor of contemporary history, specializing in the area of women's and gender history. Professor Gehmacher has published widely in German and English on 19th and 20th century international women's movements, and is the co-author of a recent intellectual biography of the German feminist and nationalist activist Kita Schirmacher. In January, she gave the Max Weber Lecture at the European University Institute, entitled Impossible, so Possible and Impossible Careers and Scholarly Households, Gendered Scholarly Personae around 1900. So I thought we could begin by talking just a little bit about the lecture. So as I mentioned, your Max Weber lecture was entitled Impossible Careers and discussed academic careers for European women around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. What, in your view, made a career in academia possible or impossible for women around this time? And what is it that changed from previous decades? What is it that made this period so unique and interesting?
First of all, we should start by saying that an academic career actually was not a realistic life plan for a woman at that time, not at all. And there were not even institutional opportunities for women to make an academic career. And the very few careers made by female academics were realized despite all these obstacles and despite, quite a lot of hostility also from the side of the institution and from men in the institution. So we are talking about really a vanguard of very determined individuals when we talk about these women who made or tried to make an academic career at the turn of the century. Because what we should keep in mind, some of them really were successful in fighting their way into the universities and to study. But then really to become a professor was something else. And this really didn't happen before the 1920s, I would say, in very few cases. But you were also asking about what made it thinkable or possible. And I think to understand this, we should keep in mind that those few women who tried, and some of them also were successful in what they tried, they came from the, I'd say, well-educated middle classes from what we could call the bourgeois liberal capitalist society. And to understand why there was probably an opening, we need to understand that this was a very dynamic cultural system. So capitalism in itself is very dynamic. And that means that the whole gender ideology that excluded women from the field of knowledge production also was an unstable thing. To give just one very important example, there is this ideology that women should marry, and marriage was the economic model for women to survive in society. But as it is easily to imagine, not all women could marry, and not all women found appropriate men. Many men didn't want to marry, or they resorted to prostitution, which was much easier to get. And then there also were economic changes. This was not the case that a family always remained wealthy. So in a way, middle-class families needed to find a secure future for their daughters. And this is why some of them, thought education would be helpful. So there's an idea that education could help women to get out of a very, well, precarious situation, middle-class women, to say. And I would say this is where this process started. And all these young women didn't just want to stay governesses or teachers for young children, because some of them really wanted more. And I would also say, together with this dynamic of a capitalist society, there was also the dynamic of a political movement, the women's movement, who was really behind the idea that women should get into this. So in this way, it was unthinkable. Institutionally, it was unthinkable, but it was also thinkable because there was already an idea that education and learning could be a way in which a woman could earn her living. And so this is how I would describe the situation around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century.
That's really fascinating, thinking about it in terms of the sort of the economic imperatives, as well as, because we're used to kind of thinking of it as a sort of an idealistic kind of motivation from the women's movement, but also thinking, you know, these women had to do something just from a purely economic perspective. Miloš, do you want to jump in there?
Yes, Professor Gehmacher. So these women, they're leaving home. They're leaving the position just of being wives. They entered academia. And I now want to connect with another part of the title of your talk that you gave, and that was this idea of scholarly personae. So this woman enter academia, and then they acquire a kind of academic self-imaging almost. Can you expand on this, what this concept means? What does it mean to have a scholarly persona, and why it's useful for your research?
Well, the concept of the scholarly persona, or the concept of the persona, actually was introduced into intellectual history, the history of knowledge, about 20 years ago by Lauren Destin and Otto Siebum. And they actually took it from the field of anthropology. And it is a concept that well, refers to metaphors of theater, because the persona is the mask the actor puts on his face to, well, to be able to convey a certain character, to make this believable. And so it, in a way, when we talk about personas, we think our field, the field of the academe, as a field of, well, a huge arena where we play our little plays and theaters. So if you stay with this metaphor of the theater, you're certainly aware of the fact that there are not just, you cannot just invent any character. There is a set of characters. There is, well, the hero, and there is the funny figure, but it's not, you cannot just invent freely. And in the same way, you cannot invent the scholarly persona freely, but there is a certain possibility where you can choose. So what you do if you invent or create a persona for yourself as a researcher, you basically connect your biography, what you have experienced until now, with the set of values and already pre-existing narratives of the field you want to become part of, or you want to stay part of. So the concept of the persona is a concept that allows to connect biographies, individual experiences with, well, the values and the norms and the templates of a professional field. In that case, the professional field of an academic person. And so basically, if you create a persona, I mean, you do that when you write a CV. what do you do when you write your CV? You are not allowed to lie. Well, you can put in things you didn't do, but you can leave out stuff that, well, wouldn't be so interesting for those persons who should give you a position. And then if you think a little bit further about that, if you create a CV, you often also create your CV by the way you live or you do certain things. You give an important lecture at a very important university, and probably you didn't want to do this, but then you do it because it, it adds to your CV. So it's not only descriptive, it's also a way of acting. You act for the CV, and this is how you create a persona. And in so doing, of course, you also can change personas a bit. In a way, in every person who writes the CV also negotiates with the bigger public of this field of research or of this discipline. Well, might this also be a persona that could fit in? But then you will be careful because you want a position. So this is how we can use the persona to understand what academics do to get their jobs and to stay in their jobs, and also, of course, how they do the whole gatekeeping thing in their field of work. And if we, as historians, want to describe these processes, we should think about what are the prevailing norms at a certain moment in history, and not just, well, what very often happens in intellectual history, and that's a bad idea, I'd say, is that you just, take the autobiographies those personalities wrote and repeat them, but then you actually do not see what they did with this and how they did it. For instance, there are important academic institutions. They want you to give you your biography at the moment you get into the institution, and then you have to live up to that biography in a way. And then when you're nearing death, they probably start rewriting that and already preparing what will be said in your necrologue. And so this is a parallel process to the career you actually live or experience, the process of, well, having a persona and changing it, or being careful to keep it in certain norms. So that, I would say, is a quite helpful way of thinking about the wider context of knowledge production to have this concept. Yeah, at least for me, I found it useful when I started reading about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I often find it's the case when there's so much of academia is writing grant proposals and so on, and you spend so much time talking about what you're going to do, and there's often not enough time to actually produce the stuff. And as you say, it's a lot about producing this narrative of who you are as an academic, and that 50% of your time is about producing this narrative. I mean, something that you just mentioned that I'd like to pick up on is you talk about how in intellectual history it often seems to be a project of sort of just reproducing the kind of the biographies or the autobiographies of the people that of how people have sort of self-presented in the past, and without a kind of a sufficient sort of critical gaze on these kind of autobiographies. And this kind of makes me think about sort of the idea of kind of the canon and who inhabits the canon, and how that can be sort of critiqued, or whether we should be critiquing it at all, or sort of getting rid of it as a concept, because it's often inhabited by people who, to a certain extent, sort of already in their lifetimes, sort of almost saw themselves as aiming to kind of inhabit this canon and seeing themselves in a long genealogy of people who, you know, read Plato at school and therefore are responding to Plato and then read, you know, Marx at school or whatever. As you say, are kind of self-creating this kind of idea. And often even in, you know, universities now, it's still these same figures who are studied as part of the canon. So I was just wondering kind of what your reaction is in terms of your own work of the idea of the canon within intellectual history, whether it's still useful having a kind of a canon as a sort of a basis of people that we study, the kind of the greats, whether you think there needs to be new people added to the canon, or whether that project in itself is just useless and we should get rid of the concept of the canon entirely. And I guess related to that is your work on Käthe Schirmacher. Do you see this as a sort of a canonizing endeavor? Are you trying to say we should be studying her as part of the canon? Or do you see it as an entirely different project? Sorry, there was a lot in there, but talk about what you'd like to talk about.
Yeah. Well, talking about canon, first of all, I would say we can't survive without a canon. I mean, in this vast sea of knowledge, we are now, in a way, we have to survive in that, and we need a canon. We need to have some common understanding what to read and what probably to read later or to read never. So it helps us, and I would say it's a useless endeavor to think about totally giving up any canon. But also, I would say a canon that does not change loses its value. It becomes a dead tradition, and then, well, we don't learn anything new from that if it's just a dead tradition. So I think we always have to work with the canon, but we also have to always question the canon. I would say those are two parts of the same thing. And then, of course, the question is how we can change the canon or how this happens. And I mean, there are very many historical examples to where this has happened. And I would say today, at least there are two very important challenges. One, I would say, is well, the fact that we are globally connected very well now, but then still what we see as the canon is very white, male, European, North American. So this is really a very, very tiny part of the knowledge production that we, at least we in Europe, see as the canon. And this is also, of course, connected with languages. I mean, there are the new Latin, of course, is English, and so this is a very, very dominant language, and it's very difficult to get through to stuff in other languages. So it's quite a long time ago that Dipesh Chakrabarty called for provincializing Europe. I think it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, and we still have a very, very far way to go in that, to really become aware of the different knowledge bases that we could have if we just would like to. But then there's only so much that can be put into one head, and so this always has to be negotiated. So I would say this is one challenge: how to deal with that problem of getting out of this just European and very narrow European canon. And the other challenge at the moment, I would say, is digitization, because in a way it helps us a lot. I mean, as a historian nowadays, I can read sources, an incredible abundance of sources I couldn't read 10 years ago, or I had to go, really I had to go far to get to an archive, to have a look at it for half an hour. And so things really have changed. And it's, in a way, it's also a democratization that so many people can approach so many sources. And it's the same with knowledge, academic knowledge. I mean, I can read the stuff colleagues all over the world have written now just from my computer at home. And I'd say I couldn't read that when I studied, although I studied in Vienna, which is, well, a former metropole and has very important and good libraries, which are not everywhere, but still, I mean, this has changed enormously. But I think we should also see the flip side of this process, that, of course, what gets digitized, this is very much linked with hierarchies of relevance. And I'd say, as there is a lot of money in digitization, I suppose that, or I know that this is more a conservative effort than it is an effort to, bring new knowledge bases into, or new sources into the world. So what we should always think about is what happens when media changes. I mean, there were several media changes in the history of knowledge, and always when there's a media change of the medium, something gets lost and something gets new light shed on it. And we're in this process now. And so we should be very critical about this. Also, I'd say from a feminist perspective, or also from perspective of class hierarchies, we should be, aware of what happens. And also, when we talk about what literature we can read, I mean, this is, we should always discuss what digital packages from what publisher monopolies are bought by our universities, and which one not. And so this is not so without any relation to power, and we should reflect on that. But you also asked me about Miloš Vojinović. So, and now we're in the field of writing biographies or writing about personalities and their works. And when we started, I mean, I'm working together on Gehmacher with, have been working together with Elisa Heinrich and Corinna Oesch. And when we started a large research project in 1913, we said, well, we have to put her into the canon to be able to deconstruct her. This was what we were very much aware of, that first of all, we have to make this person important enough that everybody, well, many people think we should know about her, but then we should be those researchers who deconstruct her. We didn't want to idealize her or to create a hero. I think heroes are rather boring. I don't know if we learn so much from them. So we have to do two steps. And I think this is what very often happens when we're talking about women or other members of marginalized groups. You have to do both. You have first to restore this person to the canon, but then you also have to question this position and well, put the whole thing into perspective. And this is, of course, much easier if you talk about somebody who is already part of the canon, but then, yeah, you never can add a new personality, and that's what I like to do. What I think is important to do, of course.
Thank you for this extensive comment, and I need to make Kathleen studied in Cambridge, and there is of course, very influential Cambridge School of Intellectual History with a very strong canon, very clear choice of topics. And I recall a few years ago, there was a joke on Twitter, which went, say something so that we know that your account was hijacked. And Cambridge Intellectual History account wrote, "We have studied Hobbes enough." So in a way, what I wanted to ask is that young people feel in a way when they try to kind of cross this border of early career scholar and let's say mid-career scholar, that there are topics that are easier to do stuff with, how to say. And I wanted to say I want to connect this with the idea of scholarly persona. So can you make a scholarly persona by sticking to the canon in a way, or then trying to attack it? Is this also a way to present yourself as a dissenter in a way? Because I would say all academics like to claim in a way that they're bringing something new, they're challenging what's old and what can be in a way improved, and just to say, well, I confirm what we all know, but then still there is a canon.
Well, I mean, it's always the kind of negotiation we have to make. I mean, you can't just go out into the desert and say, well, hear me, but nobody's there to hear you. So you always have to find a side of your work where you stay connected with those hierarchies of relevance, and you always have to make yourself visible in that field by saying something new and explaining why this new thing you say also is relevant for the others. So I would say you always have to combine these two sides of your struggle of making a career. The other point is, I mean, if we take our job serious, we want to add something. We want to contribute to knowledge production, and then this is not just a question of career. It's also a question of what we think is important, or could make our understanding of the world better. And so this also plays into this discourse, I would say.
In your answers a couple of times, you've mentioned the idea of things being important from a kind of a feminist perspective, and this being important to feminist endeavor. And one of the things I want to ask you is, would you, I mean, quite a basic question, but I think there's probably quite a lot in there, is would you consider yourself a feminist historian? And if so, what does this label entail? And how has it, do you think, changed from when you first started your career to calling yourself or not calling yourself a feminist historian now?
I would say from a political and from a theoretical perspective, I would say, yes, I call myself a feminist historian. I think it's still necessary. It would be naive to think that we live in an era of complete equality of genders in the academe. So I would say yes, from a political perspective, I am, and also from a theoretical perspective, I'd say, feminist thinking has really added a lot of very, very helpful basis for our thinking about historical events, historical societies, historical personalities. And I owe a lot to, say, Joan Scott or Donna Haraway, to name just two canonized personalities. And it would be weird not to make this visible. And I think it's also important to make it visible, because there's a certain attitude of many dissenters, not only feminist dissenters, to always just see what you yourself, made or what new contributions you made, but I think we are always also connected with the contributions of others, and so we should also clarify that by really remembering them and talking about how they changed our thinking. However, I would say, as a historian of feminism, I also know how much this concept has changed since the late 19th century, when it came into the world. I mean, when the term came into the world. And so it would be problematic to homogenize this and contend that there's just one such thing as feminist theory. There are many theories also quarreling with each other and having different views and different perspectives. And so there's not one such thing as feminist theory. That would be too small a perspective. And in this way, I would also say it's not enough to be a feminist historian. It's important to be a historian and include many different theories in what you think and how you think about historical sources. So that's how I would answer to that.
My next question will be a brief one. If you can give an advice to the next generation of women's historians, what would it be? Or to put it differently, was there any dead ends in feminist historiography in the past decades?
Well, there are always dead ends. Some of the dead ends, are deserved and others not. So, and I'd say there are theoretical dead ends, and there are those which are institutionally inflicted on you, because I'd say one thing I experienced in my life, I was lucky that at a certain point in my life, not too early, but then soon enough to survive, I got a job in the academe. And I would say really very, very much, a lot of intellectual work, gets in a way lost because it's written in a dissertation, and then that was that, because that person never gets a job in the field and has to do something else. And I mean, this happens to men too, but I'd say there are certain hierarchies to whom that happens, and it's a class thing, it's a race thing, and it's of course a gender thing, and probably a lot of other things too. But this, loss of knowledge production by inequalities in society, I think this is an important hindrance we have, and we have to deal with that. But that led me a bit astray. You were asking what my advice would be. But following on that, I'd say it's important to keep connected to your feminist colleagues, to have networks, to also form some, power bases like institutes, also to show some solidarity with each other. So something that doesn't have any power center, that doesn't exist for a very long time in the academic field, and in any other professional field. But then the other side is also, I think we should explain what we think is important for us to other historians who have other specializations, who have other interests. I think there is a broader discourse of historical knowledge, and we should contribute it, and we should also take the pain to explain what we think. We should not just, jump into very sectarian debates on very complicated things, but also come back and contribute to the bigger picture of history. I think this is important for, keeping also this whole field alive and keeping it part of the process of thinking about history.
Well, so related to that, I mean, one of the things that you do in your work that I find really, really fascinating is you talk about the importance of biography, and you have mentioned this a couple of times, and biography as a way, on the one hand, of telling women's stories, but also as a way of throwing light on kind of broader historical phenomenon. So biography as case studies is one of the things you talk about. And biography is sometimes seen as a kind of a distinct form of history. It's sometimes seen by some as sort of a lesser form of history, sometimes as a more popular form of history. There are kind of all these boundaries drawn. And I was just wondering if you could talk about why you think biography can be a particularly useful form of history, what the potential drawbacks might be, and why you think it is so important to the craft of history, and why, you know, it shouldn't be sort of pushed to one side and seen as a sort of a lesser form of history.
I mean, I think I can understand this, and I also, of course, know this type of literature where biography is used to, well, explain history in a way or make it more accessible also to people who are not professional historians, and I think it has to do with the fact that we live in an era of individualism. So this is already a way of thinking that people can easily understand, even if they are not part of the academic thinking process. So I think this is why it is useful to communicate with broader audiences. But then you asked me whether biography and history is the same, or if there are distinct forms of thinking or knowledge production. And of course, there are differences, but for me, they are very much the same in that kind of history that I'm producing. And I would say this has to do with the fact that biography, like, say, nation, is a very particular ideology and narrative that has been created at a certain moment in European history. I mean, we are here in Florence, so we have this whole production of the Renaissance man, who is an individual who creates, who is able to create a piece of art, but then also can put his name as a brand on to this piece of art. So this is a biography is a way of relating to the world that individuals use, well, in the European modernity, I would say, for several hundred years now. And this is why this ideological form has been transformed in many ways, but also has been used in historical societies and is also used today as a way of, relating to the world. And as a historian of a society, I should be able to analyze this form, to first of all to see it and not just to see its relevance in the way I think about history. And then I think to use the example of a certain person, a certain individual, to show how a society is kept together and, different fields of a society are related with each other, is a useful way of thinking about it. But we should also be aware of, often sources are available in that way. So we have legacies of personalities, and these legacies are already connected with certain, well, ideology of relevance. For instance, if a person like, I'm thinking about what Karl Pletsch wrote about Friedrich Nietzsche. This is Becoming a Genius is how he called his book. And he said, well, Nietzsche always lived already expecting a biographer and created his legacy already in expectance of a biographer. And I would add, and the wives and sister and women around him, there was no wife, but the women around him contributed to this creation of the genius through the creation of a biography. Well, as a historian, an intellectual historian, I must deconstruct this. And to deconstruct this, I must know about it. And that is a way in which I think theory of biography and also using it as a particular approach to history is very useful and can be very well, helpful to understand historical processes.
It is really fascinating when you study someone who knew during his life that he will be studied. I had an experience of that. It is really another layer of complexity for the approach when you're approaching sources. But also, I mean, it's interesting that there are also examples like I think Thomas Mann and the German historian Hans Ulrich Weller, they actually destroyed some of their diaries and personal files, which is another interesting thing to think about, the people who intentionally destroy some of their documents, and not because they have been involved in something that problematic in the sense of illegal, but just from the hide parts of the life.
So, I mean, this is so fascinating. As Miloš was saying, as you're talking, I'm already thinking so much about my own work and everything. And, you know, in terms of my own stuff, it's more the women who are kind of creating the myth around the man and deciding what should be thrown out and what should be kept and everything. Yeah, this was incredibly fascinating. And I'm sorry to say that you're going to be heading back to Vienna soon. So we're unfortunately going to be losing you from the EUI. But as you mentioned, as is so important for feminist historians and intellectual historians in general, is maintaining networks and solidarity. So I do hope that this is going to be the beginning of a long relationship of solidarity and networks between the EUI and you. And thank you so much for your time today. This was absolutely fascinating for us, and I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I also want to add to those who are listening to this, on the same YouTube channel, you can actually listen to the lecture Professor Gehmacher gave sometimes in the middle of January. Just browse a few videos back and you will be able to see it. It will be worth of your time.
Well, let me thank you very much for your extremely interesting questions and for the chance to talk to you. And well, I do hope we will stay connected through our work and in this world of the academe that keeps us going, I would say. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Miloš.
Thank you.